Opportunity. It's an honor to be here. My name is Margaret Watkins, and I'm the water quality specialist for the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. I'm doing things I don't really intend to here. If I could have some assistance here for just a moment, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Can you read that? So I'd like to begin with the fact that Grand Portage and Fond du Lac staff attended a financial workshop in 2007 that was presented by the U.S. EPA headquarters Hard Rock mining team. And we thought that it was so valuable. At that time, we had already begun to participate in evaluating the Polymet project as cooperating agencies, that Fond du Lac hosted a financial assurance workshop for the Minnesota DNR, MPCA, U.S. Forest Service staff, ERM, and Polymet staff to begin thinking about this very critical issue. And part of the impetus for that was that the state of Minnesota has spent millions of dollars remediating mine sites. And the example that I've given is reserve mining, but also the old LTV site where Polymet is planning to set up its operations left the state without a considerable amount of money. So, for those of you who don't know, financial assurance is the cost estimation process to assess the funds that are required to perform the tasks of mine cleanup. And these cost estimations aren't based on how much it would cost the company, for example, Polymet, to clean up the site. They should be based on how much it would cost a government agency to hire a contractor to do the cleanup work. And because during bankruptcy, equipment and virtually everything that can be is removed, it frequently costs the government to hire an outside contractor twice as much as it would a corporation. And so considerations for cost estimations, I have them listed. What I'm really here to talk about today is long-term operations and maintenance. But also, I'd like to say up front that earthwork, demolition, water management and treatment, things that happen sequentially as a mine is closing, also cost a lot of money, and it's dependent upon the number of acres of land that are disturbed in part. So both the type of wastewater treatment that's needed to maintain compliance with water quality standards and the number of years that treatment is needed are things that must be included in financial assurance. And when acid mine drainage is likely to occur, financial assurance needs to be increased tenfold. And even stormwater attenuation often requires long-term treatment. So that's a consideration that isn't often thought about. And also multiple mitigation strategies, so that cost estimation would be based on different types of pollution prevention to avoid groundwater pollution. It requires active wastewater treatment, liners, caps, pumping systems, barriers, and particularly in the case of Polymet, there's been a desire to move to passive treatment systems, and that's because they're orders of magnitude less expensive than active systems. So the first ever letter of credit required by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota DNR was for Mesabi Nugget. It was a $15 million in total letters of credit for the mercury filter and mine area cleanup. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to adequately study the problems, and it wasn't nearly enough for the company to be able to comply with Minnesota water quality standards. And something that we probably have all considered is that companies receive profits from mining, the public at large gets the minerals, we clearly need them, but the Minnesota public and tribes bear a huge environmental and financial risk associated with those projects. And that's why we feel that companies should be required to share meaningfully in long-term financial risk that their projects create. Perpetual mechanical treatment will likely be required for all non-ferrous operations that come into being within the state of Minnesota. And so financial assurance for perpetual treatment needs to be part of every project proposal. And as Gus Richards just said, perpetual treatment requires that the principal balance of financial assurance be enough to cover the costs of maintenance and operation using only the interest accrued. And this is in addition to financial assurance that would be set aside for closure and reclamation. Or, in other words, those earth-moving, revegetating types of activities. And so I'm going to give some quick examples. And this is to sort of put into perspective what our concerns are. And so the Zortman-Landusky mine, that's been mentioned previously as one of the mines that the Minnesota DNR has looked into in terms of financial assurance. And for each of these case examples that I've listed, I list the acres of disturbed land, and that's because that is part of the equation of how much financial assurance would be required. Another part of that equation is how much water is flowing through a site and how much water would need to be treated. So at Zortman-Landusky, there was an EIS. In the environmental impact statement, they predicted that there would be no generation of acid because of the low sulfur content of the ore. That sulfur content was 0.2%. The range for polymet, as listed in the supplemental draft EIS, is from less than 0.12 to 0.6% sulfur. Very quickly, not in hundreds of years, in slightly more than a decade, data showed widespread acid generation at Zortman-Landusky. Shortly after that, lawsuits were filed by EPA, the Montana DEQ, Fort Belknap Indian Community, and non-governmental organizations. The result of those lawsuits was a 1996 consent decree to build additional wastewater treatment systems for $32 million. In 1998, the reclamation bond that had started around $10 million was increased, and it had been increased over time, but it increased to $70 million, and Pegasus Gold filed for bankruptcy. The reclamation and closure plan that was originally approved would have cost $54 million more than the reclamation bond. The agency preferred reclamation alternative cost $28 million more than the available financial assurance. As of today, there's money set aside for perpetual treatment for that site until 2017, at which time additional funding will have to be set aside by the state to continue to treat water from that site. Summitville, another site, a modern mine, started up in 1984 with the purchase of 1,200 acres to develop a large-scale open-pit mine that disturbed 550 acres. The mining operations ended in 1991 with leaching to extract the last of the metals until March of 1992. 6 months later or so, Galactic Resources filed for bankruptcy. After the bankruptcy proceedings were completed, the site was declared a Superfund site, and the public ended up footing the bill for $155 million. Idaho Cobalt Project, another project that hasn't gotten off the ground but has been permitted, is located in Idaho. It's proposed to be an underground mine where ore would be mined from 2 separate ore bodies, disturbing only 132 acres. These facilities would include a lined dry stack tailings area and waste rock disposal facility, water management pond, water treatment facilities, and various other facilities. Idaho Cobalt for this project was required to set aside actually a bit more than $44 million in financial assurance. The reason that this is not really comparable to Polymet is because, of course, Idaho Cobalt only planned to disturb 132 acres. From Polymet's SDEIS, there will be 1,700 acres of disturbed land. The average mining processing rate for Idaho Cobalt, 800 tons per day, versus Polymet, 32,000 tons per day. Idaho Cobalt, an underground mine. Polymet, open pit. Idaho Cobalt, dry stack tailings. Polymet, unlined wet tailings. And these are all things that create additional risk. The dry stack tailings going on a liner and waste rock going on a liner prevent leaching of pollutants into the water. And so they're really two very different projects, and it's understandable then that that very low number of $44 million would be required for financial assurance. Another comparison is the Flambeau mine in Wisconsin. We often see that compared to Polymet, and it's really not a good comparison. And that's because the percent copper for the Flambeau mine was about 10%. Polymet's is about 0.3%. The Flambeau mine was only 220 feet deep and 32 acres in size. Polymet's mine pits are, between 600 and 700 feet deep, 912 acres. So Polymet is proposing a mine 90 times the volume of the Flambeau mine. The mine life, also very different. Flambeau mine, 4 years versus Polymet, 20 years. Flambeau mine, 8 million tons of waste rock versus Polymet, 308 million tons of waste rock. And also at Flambeau mine, which would be quite different than Polymet, is that there was no processing of ore at the site, so there were no tailings. The ore was shipped directly off-site. Polymet will be processing ore on-site. So now I'm going to get into examples of copper mining. And ASARCO is still operating copper mines, smelters, and refineries in the United States. But in 2009, they declared bankruptcy. And their parent companies were also ASARCO and Grupo Mexico. As part of that bankruptcy settlement and reorganization, ASARCO provided $1.7 billion to federal and state agencies for environmental cleanup and restoration. And that was for 8 sites, I believe. So back to the more modern mines. The Phelps Dodge Corporation has a couple of mines in New Mexico, the Chino and Tyrone mines. And they're located in a historic mining district in New Mexico, much like Polymet would be in northeastern Minnesota. They're both large-scale open-pit mines. They started up in the 70s. They're expecting to close around 2020. And their combined surface disturbance is very similar to Polymet. The Chino mine is expected to disturb 9,200 acres, Tyrone 6,000 acres. And the financial assurance set aside for surface reclamation and closure is $228 million for Chino and $278 for Tyrone. Both mines have provisions in place for perpetual water treatment to prevent the formation of pit lakes and to protect, and that's in order to protect groundwater and wildlife that might use the pit lakes. And so all of these examples, except for the Flambeau mine, occurred in relatively dry environments. And as Jess Richards pointed out earlier, many of the examples we have for mining where there's financial assurance are in much drier climates than Minnesota, much less water, and still, to prevent contamination, keeping pit lakes from forming and using dry stack tailings methods are used, and that's to prevent long-term pollution and the need for cleanup at sites. And so a fundamental difference between PolyMet and these other mines is that it would be located in a wet environment with interconnected surface and groundwater, and that creates a lot more risk than many, if not all, of these other projects. So now I'm going to go back to Mesabi Nugget because Bar Engineering for Mesabi Nugget developed cost estimates for treatment. And for specific types of treatment. And since we're talking about today long-term or perpetual treatment, this was important. So if you can recall, in the PolyMet Supplemental Draft EIS, PolyMet suggests that long-term treatment would cost approximately $3.5 to $6 million per year. So they're going to be operating a reverse osmosis nanofiltration wastewater treatment system. They also have pumps, liners, they have a seepage capture system for the tailings basin, quite a bit more wastewater treatment on site than is estimated here. These are only estimates for very specific types of wastewater treatment. And although the alternative to for in situ biological treatment was the only one that was estimated out for 20 years, I still went through the math, put it out there for you. It's simple math to show that if you double the operation and maintenance of these treatment systems, especially the nanofiltration reverse osmosis system, then PolyMet's estimates, the high end of their estimate, at $6 million per year is 60% of Bar Engineering's estimate for Mesabi Nugget, or 6%. So, again, what I've done is a very back-of-the-envelope calculation using Bar Engineering's estimates of treatment costs for Mesabi Nugget, and the purpose, again, I say, of using this is that Bar Engineering is a certified engineering firm that does a lot of work for numerous mining companies, including PolyMet. And so, back-of-the-envelope calculation, and that's truly all it is, using fixed interest, no inflation, absolutely nothing else. The financial set-aside that you would have to be able to pay for operation and maintenance of these specific types of systems range for nanofiltration between $168 million and $336 million. So now I move forward with this to, even though based on BAR's estimates for reverse osmosis nanofiltration operation and maintenance for Mesabi Nugget on the same property that Polymet would be located on as being far more expensive. I used Polymet's estimates from the SDEIS, and again, using fixed interest, no inflation, back-of-the-envelope calculation, and the financial set-aside ranged at the high end from $200 million to $400 million. And so then I looked at a more sophisticated or a complex model of financial assurance using an average interest rate of 7%, average inflation rate of 2%, and with a higher interest rate, the amount of financial assurance required is higher because it includes inflation. And again, using an even more sophisticated model, what we see again is that the financial assurance doesn't go up, it goes up, it doesn't go down. So the back of the envelope calculation is strictly a range finder. And that's the message that I'd like to bring to you today, that this is a very critical issue. I don't disagree with the Minnesota DNR that it would be very difficult at this time to set in stone the amount of financial assurance that would be required to ensure that wastewater treatment was available for 500 years. But what I do want to demonstrate from this is that this is a huge financial liability for the taxpayers of the state, and that I'm really thankful to have this opportunity to speak to you today, and that you are considering this very important issue.
Thank you for your testimony. Are there questions from members? Representative Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Watkins, thank you for your testimony. I'm also looking to you to maybe expand a little bit on some of, since you're a water quality expert, I believe that was your field. Some of the questions that have been asked about contamination, where it goes, what we know about it, and I'm wondering if you've looked at that and found any different findings than what we've gotten from Polymet, having it confined strictly to the Portage River, especially since you're up there on the boundary waters. Could you talk a little bit about that? And if so, I guess the other question is, some of the concerns I've at least heard from some of our tribal communities is the impact on our wild rice. So I'm wondering if you would speak to those two issues.
Madam Chair and Committee, yes, I have reviewed the Polymet modeling, and not only do we have differences of opinion about flows in the Portage River and flows in the Embarrass River and something called storativity or storage coefficients used in the Embarrass River side. When in 2006, when Grand Portage, Fond du Lac, and Bois Forte were allowed to participate in the review of Polymet, we recommended that flow data be collected and that additional groundwater monitoring wells be installed in the bedrock particularly, but also in the surficial aquifer. We believe that this is a very data poor project, and in fact, as part of the Cliffs consent decree to clean up the existing LTV tailings basin water discharges and Area Pit 5 discharges, Bar Engineering measured flows in the streams, the tributaries to the Embarrass River. That data was never used in the modeling. The modeling for flows was estimated, and the flows in the Embarrass River were estimated from gauging data that was from 1942 to 1964. In 1942, there were no mining features in the Embarrass River watershed, and we can demonstrate that by aerial photos. So many of those tributary streams didn't exist. So trying to model flows and add a bit of additional flow for the tailings basin, because that was water that was taken out of the Portage River watershed when tailings were put into the LTV tailings basin, isn't scientific. And the storage coefficients that were used to model the surface aquifer and bedrock aquifer at the tailings basin site cannot be found in a range of any scientifically peer-reviewed literature. We find that to be flawed science. And in the Portage River, we determined, using the flow data from the old gauging data, which is somewhat newer than what was used in the Embarrass River, that there was additional base flow that, and it's something that we've brought up continuously, because that affects the amount of water that would need to be treated. It affects how much, when the pit begins to refill at Polymet, that affects how much water would have to be treated to mix with the polluted water flowing into the pit. That's part of the mitigation strategies. So we have big questions about whether those mitigation strategies would actually work. And it goes to the heart of financial assurance, because if there's more water flowing in, there's more water that needs to be treated. So I hope that I sort of answered that, in a general way.
Thank you. One more question.
Just one follow-up. So the issue of failure to have peer review and the quality of the science is one thing, and then I guess just the other thing is, are you concerned that these flows will take the contamination up to the boundary waters of BWCA by the Dunk River or any other?
No, but I am concerned that will flow into the St. Louis River and into Lake Superior, the largest freshwater resource in the United States.
Representative Phil.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like for the Ms. Watkins to clarify her statement that she's not concerned about the boundary waters and the drainage from this the discharges going into the boundary waters. Exactly where do they go? My question would be, do the discharges from this go into the boundary waters?
Madam Chair, Committee, no, they do not flow into the boundary waters. They flow into the Partridge and Embarrass River sub-watersheds, which flow into the St. Louis River, which flows into Lake Superior.
Representative Phil, did you have a follow-up?
No, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make it clear to those and anyone listening that this project really has no effect on the boundary waters whatsoever, and it's a lot of information that suggests that it might by people who aren't in the know. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I appreciate your making the trip. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, next we have Betsy Daub, Friends of the Boundary Waters. From now on, each of the testifiers will have 5 minutes, and we will let them know how time is going. I don't intend to cut anybody off in mid-sentence, but it does give a clue to wrap up.
Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee, my name is Betsy Daub, and I am